Good evening. AnewZ's wide-ranging interview with President Aliyev of Azerbaijan has provoked plenty of debate and discussion, not just here in Baku, but in Europe too. Well, tonight we take a look at the most powerful talking points from yesterday's in-depth discussion, and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by our very own Orkan Amashov. But first, Ollie Barrett reports now from London on how diplomats and world leaders are likely to react.
Well, Guy, this will have been a closely watched interview in European and other capitals around the world. Very wide-ranging indeed in terms of the themes that were covered by President Aliyev, and that's part of the reason that it would have been so closely watched by so many different teams of diplomats and governments worldwide. If we go through some of those themes, obviously on prospects for a peace treaty, the abolition of the Minsk Group, the amendment of Armenia's constitution, the various different countries and organisations involved in peace discussions with regards to all of that will have been watching those latest comments very closely indeed, paying close attention to the exact words that were used. The European Union was an interesting segment of the interview as well. I don't think the European Commission in Brussels would have been surprised to hear that 2024 was considered a difficult year for relations between Baku and Brussels, and both sides will clearly be hoping that they can push on towards better relations in the coming year ahead. France, obviously relations between France and Azerbaijan are deeply strained at the moment, so another reason why French diplomats will have been watching this interview very closely. I think Paris will have been surprised perhaps in some of the language that was used, the word mania described about Emmanuel Macron, but then again maybe not, because of course this is a week in which Emmanuel Macron himself criticised Azerbaijan over what he sees as its influence in some French territories worldwide. So as I say, French diplomats will have been keeping a very close eye on this issue as well for really the latest sense of President Aliyev's position and thinking and feelings towards France and the French President Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron himself very much politically weakened in France at the moment, at the top of a government that he's struggling really to hold together, certainly struggling to be able to govern in a meaningful way. Very strong words about Iran. Lots of countries currently reassessing their positions and their relations with Syria after the removal of the government of Bashar al-Assad. So again, another reason that those comments will have been monitored very closely indeed. A key theme of the interview in terms of Azerbaijan welcoming recent developments there, and we've seen a cautious welcoming of developments in Syria by governments like the British government here in London and the administration in Washington as well, working out exactly how they are going to deal with the new leaders of Syria going forward. Also a cautious optimism in many European capitals and in Washington about the possibility of a hostage deal of some sort between Israel and Hamas that could lead potentially to the end of this stage of the conflict in Gaza. That was something that President Aliyev was calling for in the interview too. Washington, certainly the incoming administration in Washington will have been pleased to hear President Aliyev talking about Donald Trump in the terms in which he did. The idea of the clear messages that he says that Donald Trump sets out, the direct messages that are made by the incoming president-elect in Washington, and therefore the prospects for US-Azerbaijan ties. Now, it's worth saying that some European capitals and leaders don't feel necessarily exactly the same way about the incoming US president, not least because of some of the comments that he's been making this very week about wanting to, for example, take US control of Greenland. That has led to a pretty strong pushback from Brussels and from European politicians too. The French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot saying there is no question of the EU letting other nations in the world, whoever they may be, attack its sovereign borders. So as President Aliyev is eyeing close ties between Washington and Baku in the years ahead, it's certainly also the case that some European capitals are very worried about the prospects for some of the things that Donald Trump has been saying in recent days, and also in the election campaign as well. But with Azerbaijan, such a key country in such a key region for global affairs, as I say, teams of diplomats across Europe, across the United States and beyond as well will have been watching this interview very closely indeed, this wide-ranging interview touching on so many currently important global themes. Ollie Barrett in London for AnewZ.
Ollie Barrett for us there in London. Orkan, an awful lot to unpack from what the President said yesterday. We've got a lot to get through. Just give me your reaction, your sense of what you heard, what you read in the interview from
this
yesterday.
interview is given by President. The regular interview is given annually. They give us a clear sense of what could be expected from Azerbaijan. Effectively, Azerbaijan's foreign policy, the certain elements related to Azerbaijan's internal politics, are clearly expressed in those interviews. And on the basis of that interview, effectively, you could write 10, 15 analytical pieces in relation to the prospects of Azerbaijani-Armenian peace deal, about the future of Azerbaijani-Iranian relations, organization of Turkish states, and so forth. What is quite extraordinary, in my view, is President Aliyev's ability in a very impromptu style, discuss wide range of issues, interconnected but still a diverse area of issues in such a succinct manner, and also his ability to explain reasonably very complex issues in a very simple language. I think this is one of the key defining characteristics. I think on the basis of what he said, I think there's a degree of predictability about what Azerbaijan will do internationally. I think that predictability is a key defining characteristic of Azerbaijani foreign policy, and that particular element was clearly emphasized during that long interview, which you participated yourself.
And you mentioned predictability there. I think one of the things that many people around the world didn't predict was the coming back to power of President Donald Trump. That is something, though, that President Aliyev had alluded to in the past. Let's just take a look at this package now.
Somebody has to help this country, and if they don't, the country and the world are in big trouble.
With 12 days left until President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration ceremony, with his victory having already been certified by the US Congress, many now seem to have forgotten that his return to the White House was once deemed unthinkable. For the man himself, a comeback in some form or shape has perhaps never been a matter of if, but that of must, even when he bid farewell to Washington on a cold January morning in early 2021.
Thank you and farewell. God bless you. God bless the United States of America.
In the years that followed, Trump faced tribulations and trials, being squarely blamed for the Republican losses, and many external observers did not deign to consider his journey from a diminished ex-president to a victor clinching last-ditch triumph as remotely possible. This was the case in July 2024 too, as Trump was doing his level best to turn his illegal woes into fuel nurturing voters' anger, capitalizing on public discontent engulfing the country over inflation. He was also making his way through indictments, convictions and assassination attempts. Even when he stood surrounded by Secret Service agents, raising his fist in the air, shouting "Fight, fight, fight," after an assassination attempt made on the 13th of July, not his prospective victory, but future glory's failure that many thought would be possible. However, unpredictability, a quality generally associated with Trump's personality, was perceived in a different light by some others. For Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev, for instance, his prospects were not so impossible. when questioned about the subject at the Newshour Global Media Forum in July 2024, the Azerbaijani leader did not shy away from making his views clear.
I am absolutely sure that you know perfectly well what preference I would make. And I think I am not the only one in Azerbaijan. As far as we are concerned, of course we look at this situation through our own prism. The decision will be made by the American people. It is their president that will be elected. But it is also of great importance for the whole world, because the fate of many and many peoples and countries will largely depend on the decisions that will be made by the first person of the United States.
Back then, Aliyev also stated that his country enjoyed very fruitful cooperation based on mutual respect, adding that relations with the United States were largely stable under the Republican administration.
During the presidency of President Trump, we enjoyed very fruitful cooperation, relations based on mutual respect and appreciation of mutual support on different tracks. Our relations with the United States were pretty stable, despite ups and downs which happened not on our initiative.
Therefore,
For Aliyev, Trump's campaign message, built upon an argument that there were no wars under his administration, was something deserving respect. Indeed, this evaluation of the Azerbaijani leader could most certainly be regarded as amounting to, if not an outright endorsement, but a subtle prediction and carefully constructed statement as to his preference. And when asked about President-elect Trump's return to the White House during a press conference on the 7th of January, Ilham Aliyev reiterated his earlier thoughts, reflecting on the prospects of Baku-Washington relations.
There is hope. Mr. Trump sends very clear, direct messages with his statements. Now, it might not be possible to analyze all of them, but I can say that the vast majority of them are shared by Azerbaijani society. Therefore, hopes are high. That's why I said that there is hope. There is great hope. This includes the possibility of advancing US-Azerbaijan strategic relations. I believe that if both sides are interested, we can elevate US-Azerbaijan relations to a strategic level.
Well, indeed, there seems to be a sense of hope in the air. The year 2025 will be different. Of that, there is no doubt. Yet, whether the perceived optimism surrounding Trump's re-election will materialize is another question.
Or can President Aliyev then able perhaps to see something that others at the time could not?
Yeah, for many, as the particular source says, for many, Trump's re-election was utterly unthinkable, in particular during 2022 and 2023. And what President Aliyev said in July, and I was attending that global media forum held in Newshour, he did say something which could be classified as a statement of preference, if not an outright endorsement of Trump's election. He said that on the basis of the perception about Trump and also about the fact that he's so positively received, on the basis of that under Trump's administration there were no wars, there were no US administration initiated war happened. There was a degree of positive outlook about him, and he did effectively predict Trump's re-election back then. The language employed was incredibly cautious, of course, measured and very diplomatic, and what happened later is a clear testament to Trump's resilience and President Aliyev's ability to discern the reality back then. Let me remind you that was back in July 2024. It was when Kamala Harris wasn't a part of the process. And even after that incident on the 13th of July, after the assassination attempt against Trump, many would have said that, yes, this would make sure Trump would go in the annals of history as a hero, but his success was not a foregone conclusion.
Absolutely. And one of the things that President Trump's resurgence is possibly emblematic of is this slight change in New World Order, this different trajectory which seems to be emerging in various countries around the world. So I was keen to ask the President yesterday what he thinks about globalization and whether he thinks that actually the term, the concept itself has had its day. Let's have a quick listen.
If you notice, last several years, we don't hear a lot about globalization. It was a kind of a trend, maybe 10, 15 years ago, but it didn't work because many countries were opposing it, and for many countries, it was not clear what does it mean. Globalization mean more trade, or globalization mean a unification of all into one substance, if I may use this word. So we've been always against it, and we've been very vocal, even during the times when globalization was considered by the main trend of Western politics. But even before President Trump was elected, this issue more or less is not on top of the agenda, but I'm sure that it will be completely eliminated because it didn't work. Many people did not even understand what it means, and it was used as a tool of penetration and establishing platforms for domination and for actually brainwashing of young generation, because the main target of globalization were young generation, because that was calculated approach in order to make them so-called people of the world, people without culture, without nationality, without national identity, without national pride. Be just a kind of a robot in the hands of those who have a remote control. So I'm sure it's done already, it's finished.
I think that globalization of that sort had its day, really. If we talk about a globalization of the type wherein there is no place for national identities, everything is cosmopolitan, with anything nationally driven being perceived as jingoistic. That sort of globalization was not a good thing in the first place, and it was a very extreme interpretation of globalization that prevailed the minds of some people. And when it comes to Trump, I think this is in connection with globalization. His policy, as perceived in this part of the world, does not seem to be predicated on the export of values in the shape of humanitarian intervention into different parts of the world, which would be regarded as militating against the interests of the regional actors in different parts of the world. There's a very clear realization that there's not going to be one superpower with extensive network the influencing the entire world, but there will be a room for regional actors emerging, and in certain cases, in the case of Turkey, which was an empire 600 years ago, re-emerging and actually being having a greater deal of influence within its own region. And I think President Aliyev, as a man who has been in charge of the country since 2003, has dealt with many American diplomats, and I think that his experience when it comes to the Karabakh process, the peace negotiations before 2020 and the war itself, gave him a sense that if you are entirely convinced about the righteousness of your own foreign policy, if you're absolutely sure that what you're doing within your sovereign borders for the sake of your own national interests is perfectly justified by reason, and also it is fair, and also within the confines of international law, then you have to take an action drastically with a sense of proportion, of course, and you will be on the right side of history. And that happened back in 2020. And I think that gave him a sense of being on the right side of history. He felt sort of a testosterone of high crisis and found himself on the right side of history. And within the larger scheme of the geopolitics, somebody like Trump would evaluate this sort of policy as being perfectly reasonable because it does not militate against US interests. So in many ways, I think that we are on the verge of being transformed into a new type of process. And Trump's election, in many ways, is reflective of that transformation. It is a retrenchment of superglobal powers and also emergence of regional actors and the world where the element of domination will give way to some sort of dialogue based on the acceptance of each other's interests.
One of the things that I found very interesting about the conversation yesterday was the ability to connect geopolitical issues with cultural elements too. One of the points that the president made was that the problem with globalization, other than the fact that many people feel that they didn't ask for it in the first place, was that young people in some areas, in some senses, may have been deprived of the enjoyment and development of their own culture, and that now perhaps might be able to flourish in a way that would not have been possible over the past few years.
Yes, indeed. Because when it comes to the global culture of multicultural dimension, that sort of culture will exist anyway. But the question here is that if there is anything valuable that you consider to be integral to your own national identity or to your own regional identity, is there anything within that identity worthy of protection? I think that at a certain stage we reach the point wherein anything remotely classified as a national interest was deemed to be against our common interest. I think that there should be sort of a proper balance in that sense. And also, with all due fairness, countries like Azerbaijan, bearing in mind their geographical size and their clout, which is increasing but still relatively limited, are very, very convinced of the necessity of protecting that national identity. And also, it's all about what sort of culture we are assuming as our own. That global culture, in many ways, was largely driven by the popular culture in the United States. So it was sort of meditating against your own survival instincts. And perhaps under the current geopolitical circumstances, there will be more room for the acknowledgement of the critical vitality of national characteristics. And we see that change in the global world. We see in terms of what is happening in the UK and in the United States, rise of moderate right-wing policies. I'm not talking about the extreme form of right-wing policy. That gives credence to some sort of conservatism, which 10, 15 years ago was considered to be backwards.
And a non-interventionist ideology, a strategy where countries are not interfering by and large with the way other countries are run. That doesn't mean that countries can't and won't help out, and Syria is one obvious example of that. Let's just have a look at what the president had to say on the subject of Syria.
Whatever is in Turkey's interest, it is in our interest too. Our security is the same, our interests are the same, and our future is the same, both in the Middle East and at the same time in Europe. We touched on this issue a little. A completely new situation is emerging. A strong Turkish factor will play a key role here. We are with Turkey. In other words, our power will increase even more. The vast geography encompassing Europe, Asia, the South Caucasus, and the Caspian Basin is already a serious geopolitical factor in itself. Military power, political power, economic potential, unity, and today it is impossible to see countries so interconnected as Turkey and Azerbaijan anywhere in the world. Therefore, we are very hopeful, and the changes in Syria make us very happy. First for Turkey, and secondly for ourselves. Because for 12 years, we have had no relations with Syria.
Now, Orkan, one of the major themes of the interview yesterday, something that has been picked up by the international press, has been, of course, the president's views and comments about Monsieur Macron. Let's just have a quick listen to what the president had to say, and also the association with the situation between Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Fransa'ya geldikdə orada indi siyasi səhnədə nələr baş verir? Şimdi herkes özü görür.
As for France, what is happening on the political scene there now? Everyone can see that. Yesterday, the French president made further absurd accusations against Azerbaijan. It seems that Mr. Macron cannot live without Azerbaijan. He has some kind of mania and wants to blame all his sins on us. I think that if we have become so strong that we can interfere in the internal affairs of France and change something, we can simply be proud of it. In fact, this statement is an admission of his own helplessness. A president of a great state suffers from the actions of a country with a population of 10 million located far away in the Caucasus region. However, we have nothing to do with the internal affairs of France. Simply put, this was brought about by wrong approaches and irrelevant policies. If there is a consensus in French political circles, it is a consensus only on Azerbaijanophobia.
Ümid edirəm ki, bizim bütün sülh müqaviləsi ilə bağlı şərtlər.
I hope that all our conditions regarding the peace treaty will be accepted, because there are no extraordinary issues in these conditions. The abolition of the Minsk Group, the amendment of the Constitution. Without these, a peace treaty is impossible. If Armenia does not need a peace treaty, we do not need it either. We can live and conduct our own policy without signing it. In other words, I would still advise the Armenian side to weigh everything up, including geopolitical changes in the world. Their close friends are being shamefully removed from the political scene. Yesterday, news came that Mr. Trudeau, a close friend of Armenia and Pashinyan, also had to resign.
Cənab Trudeau da vəzifədən getməli oldu.
Well, Orkan, the relationship between France and Azerbaijan is well documented. Many people in this country, in this region, will be very familiar with it. And also the link between that relationship and also the situation between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Give me your sense of what the president said and what we think we can take from that going forward.
You phrase the question in a perfectly acceptable way, because there is an inextricable connection between what is presently happening between Azerbaijan and Armenia about the stumbling blocks and there's some problematic elements involving Azerbaijani-French relations. I don't necessarily think that the current state of affairs between Paris and Baku was inevitable from the very beginning. What happened in 2020, Azerbaijan managed to recover its territorial integrity and defeat Armenia during that war. And for France, this was perceived as a defeat of France rather than defeat of Armenia. And we remember what President Emmanuel Macron said back in November 2020, saying that they will never allow the reconquest of the Upper Karabakh by Azerbaijan. Upper Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. One cannot sort of conquer its own territory. So effectively, what is presently happening is a continuation of that logic. What seems to be the case, and it is very clear what from President Aliyev said, France is still struggling to adjust to the realities established after 2020. And what is also very interesting is when it comes to Azerbaijan and criticism levied against Azerbaijan, there is a degree of unity within the French political landscape. Whether this person supports Macron or she's against Macron, they will all be against Azerbaijan, because those people who were visiting the territory of Azerbaijan, which was under the temporary control of Russian peacekeeping forces, they were against the President Macron. And I think that this element is unlikely to change anytime soon. And the French role is perceived as destructive by Azerbaijan because French is also arming Armenia. And militarization of Armenia in the context of the achievement of a long-awaited peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia is a very, very, very key issue, because the fact here is that Azerbaijan recovered its territorial integrity. Armenia was an occupying state until 2020, and in some ways until 2023. And before there is a peace deal between these two countries, giving armament, weapons to the country which occupied another country's territory would give rise to the assumption that the peace between them will not be maintained, will not be established anytime soon. My feeling is said, some of the key elements about Azerbaijan and Armenian peace process have been reiterated already. Without the constitutional change involving the territorial pretensions against the Karabakh region of Azerbaijan and some other elements, the peace treaty will not be achieved.
Okay, another big issue, another key country that many people, not just Azerbaijan, are trying to come to terms with in terms of their bilateral relations is Iran. Let's just have a quick look at what the president said on that subject.
It
is difficult to analyze the relations with the new government because I have not personally met with the new president. If and when it happens, then I can talk about it. As for the provincial mullah's hateful attitude towards us, this is not the first time. That mullah from the city of Ardabil has repeatedly used insulting expressions against Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijani people, including me. The question here is what the attitude of the person who appointed him to that position is. After all, he did not come and sit there on his own. We know very well who appointed him. What is his reaction? Does he support this or not? And who will apologize to Azerbaijan? Will they apologize or not? The regret in the statement of the Iranian Foreign Ministry is not enough. There was an open insult. Both the presidents of Turkey and Azerbaijan, our peoples, and during a live broadcast at an official event. And only regret. This, of course, is unacceptable. Therefore, we believe that the provincial mullah should be punished. At the very least, he should be dismissed from his post and made to apologize to Azerbaijan. This is the point.
Well, thanks to Orkan Amashov, as always, for joining us. And thank you too for watching. That is all we have time for on this special edition of NewsHour. Please do stay with us on AnewZ for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, we wish you a very pleasant evening ahead.